So, what if the greatest barrier to your mission was never a lack of opportunity, but actually a failure of attention?
Oh, that's such a heavy question right out of the gate.
Right. I mean, usually when we talk about a lack of success, whether you're, leading a community project or trying to foster a neighborhood initiative or even directing a local nonprofit, we immediately look at the resources.
Exactly. We look at the balance sheet.
Yeah, we ask, did we have enough funding? Did we have enough reach? Did we market this correctly? It becomes this very mechanical diagnosis. We treat our communities like equations that just need the right variables input into them.
Yeah, like if we just put more money in, we get more impact out.
Exactly. But then you step into the framework we're looking at today, and suddenly that whole mechanical view is completely upended. I mean, we're looking at a landscape that challenges the very premise of how we engage with the physical world and the people right outside our doors.
It really forces a complete recalibration. You have to stop
Yeah.
looking at your toolkit and start looking at your own eyesight,
Yeah,
honestly.
yeah.
We're so conditioned to ask, how do we get people to pay attention to us? But this framework demands we ask, why have we failed to pay attention to them? It's a huge shift from performance to observation.
It really is. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We're digging into a framework today called Mapping for Mission, seeing what we've overlooked.
It's such a great title.
It is. It's essentially this diagnostic tool that forces organizations to stop using megaphones and start using magnifying glasses.
I love that visual.
Yeah, and the mission of this deep dive is to really unpack how organizations, specifically churches and ministries, though, I mean, the underlying mechanics here apply to literally any community leader or urban planner, can shift from a noisy transactional approach to one rooted in deep embedded observation.
Right, because we've got a massive stack of sources today.
We really do.
We're looking at the foundational arguments, the reflective exercises, practical applications, and these incredibly thorough diagnostic tools provided in the text.
Yeah, and we aren't just going to summarize this, right? We're going to get into the psychological and organizational weeds of why it is so difficult to actually see the place where you live.
And the density of this material is what makes it so compelling. It doesn't just offer an abstract theory of community engagement. It provides a rigorous, step-by-step diagnostic for how we relate to the physical and social geography around us.
Totally.
It challenges the assumption that good intentions naturally lead to good interventions.
Which is such a tough pill to swallow for a lot of leaders. And before we go any further, I want to emphasize why you, the listener, should care about this.
Yeah, this is so applicable.
Whether you're leading a massive organizational initiative, building a grassroots community project, or, if you're simply trying to be a decent neighbor in a world that is completely suffering from digital information overload, this deep dive offers a radical blueprint for building genuine trust.
Trust through careful, deliberate attention.
Yes. And honestly, the cover art of the text perfectly sets the stage for everything we're going to discuss today. It features this striking visual. There's a magnifying glass focused intensely on a diverse group of people.
Right.
And beneath it is a map scattered with physical location pins. There's a compass, a pair of binoculars, and this spiral notebook with sticky notes explicitly asking three questions: who, where, and needs.
That cover imagery is like an argument in itself.
Yeah.
A compass, binoculars, a map, a magnifying glass. These are instruments of observation, of navigation, and proximity. But notice what is entirely absent from that cover.
What's that?
There's no megaphone, there's no microphone, there's no broadcasting tower.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you're right.
The visual argument is immediate and confrontational. It's stating that your primary job is to see, to locate, and to understand, long before you ever open your mouth to speak or launch a program to serve.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the why. Because to understand why we even need binoculars or a compass, we really have to look at the current landscape.
Right, the environment we're operating in.
Exactly. The source material begins with this brutal diagnosis of modern organizational culture. It argues that we live in an age that heavily rewards speed, visibility, and, frankly, constant self-promotion.
Yeah, we are swimming in what the text calls broadcast logic, and we really need to dissect what that actually means.
Let's do it.
So broadcast logic is the assumption that the wider you throw your net, the more impact you're having. Ministries, community organizations, nonprofits, they often fall into the exact same psychological trap as modern tech brands or digital creators.
Oh, for sure.
They start measuring their actual success by reach, by impressions, by the sheer velocity of their momentum.
And it creates organizations that are described in the text with this chilling phrase. It says they are active but not attentive, visible but not relational, busy but not fruitful.
Busy but not fruitful. That hurts to hear.
It does. Let's think about the biology of that for a second. Why do humans default to broadcast logic? I suspect it's because algorithms and reach metrics mimic the dopamine hit of actual human connection.
Oh, absolutely.
A leader sees 1,000 likes on a post about their new community project, and their brain processes that as 1,000 deep, meaningful relationships. But it's a biological lie.
That is a crucial insight right there. The brain is tricked by the scale of the interaction, and it completely misses the shallowness of it.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating here is how the text applies this to an era of digital saturation. We are in an environment where algorithms can artificially amplify messages, right?
Right.
Artificial intelligence can accelerate the production of content so that you are churning out newsletters and updates at lightning speed.
Just constant noise.
Exactly. Marketing can generate massive, sudden amounts of attention. But the critical distinction the text makes is that none of those mechanisms can manufacture credibility.
Say that again? That's huge.
Algorithms cannot create credibility. AI cannot replace the physical friction of human presence. You are just automating the noise, you aren't deepening the relationship.
You see this everywhere, too. An organization might have, like, a mailing list of 20,000 people, or this perfectly curated, highly produced social media feed. And the board of directors looks at those numbers and thinks, look at our incredible reach. We are changing the city.
Yeah, they feel so successful.
But the text is pointing out that in an environment where literally everyone is screaming into the void, relying on broadcast logic just means you're adding another layer of static to the noise. I mean, the average person is exposed to thousands of marketing messages a day. They're exposed to more content than their prefrontal cortex can even process, and more promises than they can safely trust.
And this leads the author to draw a really stark contrast between two fundamentally different types of leadership.
Okay, what are they?
On one side, you have performative leadership.
Yeah.
This is a leadership style obsessed with extraction and attraction. The primary questions driving performative leadership are always,
How do we get them to come to us?
exactly, what flashy event will generate the most interest? What program will produce the highest attendance numbers? It is an inward-facing panic disguised as an outward-facing mission.
Wow, inward-facing panic. That is so accurate.
Right. And then on the other side, you have what the text calls incarnational or embedded leadership. This type of leadership flips the script entirely.
How so?
Instead of asking how to extract people from their context to fill your building, it asks, how do we love faithfully where they already are? To use secular terms, it is deeply embedded, localized solidarity.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy. I think about the difference between a massive illuminated billboard on a busy interstate highway and like a small, slightly rundown corner store in a local neighborhood.
Oh, I like this.
The modern approach to community building often acts exactly like that highway billboard. It's highly visible, it costs a fortune to maintain, it gets hundreds of thousands of visual impressions every single day as cars zoom by at 70 miles an hour.
But zero actual connection.
Absolutely zero relationships. The billboard does not know who is driving by. It doesn't know if the driver is weeping, if they just lost their job, or if they're rushing to a hospital. It just beams its message out into the dark.
It's totally indifferent to the reality of the person seeing it.
Exactly. Now look at the corner store owner. They don't have a billboard. They don't have a marketing budget. But they know exactly who comes in at 6 a.m. for black coffee before their warehouse shift.
Right. They know their regulars.
They know whose kids are struggling in school. They know who is short on rent this month. The billboard has reach, but the corner store has trust.
And the return on investment for that trust is entirely different from the return on investment for reach.
How so?
The text argues that credibility, like real, enduring credibility, is not built through louder communication or higher production values. It's built through presence, fidelity, and a hyper-local understanding. It is built when a community gradually recognizes that you aren't merely trying to extract something from them, like their attendance to boost your metrics or their donations to fund your expansion.
Right, you aren't using them.
Exactly. They realize you are genuinely willing to walk alongside them in the mud of their daily lives.
I really want to linger on the dark side of that billboard mentality, though, because it's not just that broadcast logic is ineffective. The text asserts that this transactional mindset actively harms communities.
Yes, it does.
Good intentions, when funneled through broadcast logic, cause leaders to completely overlook real people.
It causes harm because when you rely on broadcast logic, you inevitably start treating people as demographic categories rather than neighbors with complex, contradictory stories.
You flatten them out.
You reduce a vibrant, suffering, resilient neighborhood to a set of flat statistics on a spreadsheet. And when you do that, you assume that the needs of the community are obvious.
And those assumptions are usually wrong, right?
Well, almost always. They're based on your own cultural biases. You end up
Wow.
creating generic, one-size-fits-all ministries or interventions that aggressively address problems the community doesn't actually have while remaining totally blind to the heavy burdens they carry every single day.
So if broadcast logic fails because it's so detached and generic and statistically driven, the cure has to be highly specific.
It has to be grounded.
Right, grounded in the dirt. And this leads us into the first major paradigm shift of the source material, the theology of place and the discipline of observation.
This is where it gets really practical.
And again, even though this uses theological language, the psychological requirement here applies to literally anyone trying to understand a neighborhood.
The text poses a very challenging question right out of the gate here. It asks, if Scripture treats place as spiritually meaningful, why do so many churches treat geography as irrelevant?
That is a profound indictment.
It really is.
And the source points out that historically, in the texts these organizations base their existence on, the founding figure Jesus ministered in incredibly specific geographical coordinates.
He was deeply local.
Yes. He didn't just broadcast a generalized moral message from the clouds to humanity at large. He walked specific dirt roads, visited specific communal wells, and entered specific culturally fraught homes.
It completely disrupts this modern corporate assumption that outreach could be franchised,
Exactly, like detached from local geography. A neighborhood in downtown Chicago is not a suburb in Dallas, and it is not a rural farming town in Idaho. The soil is different.
What's fascinating here is how taking place seriously means acknowledging that the dynamics of a specific zip code, its history, its pain, its informal networks of care, are already in motion before you ever arrive to quote-unquote help.
You aren't the main character arriving to save the day.
Exactly. The text challenges leaders to do what it calls a scriptural geography journal, reading their foundational texts through the lens of land, city, road, and neighborhood. It makes you realize that a place-blind approach is deeply flawed. It's the arrogance of assuming that your methodology is so superior that the local context doesn't even matter.
But to actually begin to see that specific place, the book demands a practice it calls observation before serving. And this is where the friction really begins for action-oriented leaders.
Oh yeah, leaders hate this part.
They do. The book asks, what have you rushed to fix before you had learned to understand? It literally accuses us of confusing speed with wisdom.
Which brings us back to the instruments on the cover art. The compass, the binoculars, the map.
Right. These are tools for navigating reality as it actually exists, not as you wish it existed. The text elevates mapping a community from a mere strategic demographic exercise to a discipline of the ego.
A discipline of the ego.
Yeah.
That's powerful. It introduces practical exercises, like the City as Scripture Walk, where leaders are asked to physically walk through their city and read it, looking for the physical signs of hope, the hidden signs of brokenness, lament, and promise.
There is one exercise in the practical applications that I found both fascinating and terrifying.
Oh, which one?
It's called observation without interpretation.
Yes, that one is so hard.
The instructions are deceptively simple. You spend 20 to 30 minutes in one location, a transit point, a public park, a market, outside a local school. You sit there with a notebook, and you write down only what you see, hear, and physically sense.
No judgments allowed.
Right. You are explicitly forbidden from explaining, diagnosing, or interpreting anything you write down. You must separate raw facts from your assumptions.
It sounds like a basic mindfulness exercise. But psychologically, it is incredibly exhausting for leaders who are professionally trained to be problem solvers.
Why is it so exhausting?
Think about the reticular activating system in the human brain. Its entire job is to filter out the millions of bits of sensory data you encounter every second, and only present your conscious mind with information that aligns with your existing beliefs and goals.
So we're wired to jump to conclusions.
We are biologically conditioned to see a situation, categorize it immediately, and interpret it through our own lens, usually to figure out how our organization can fix it or benefit from it. To sit and just observe the data without categorizing it takes an immense amount of cognitive restraint.
Here's where it gets really interesting, but also challenging, though. I'm stuck on this idea of urgency being a form of arrogance.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because if I'm doing this exercise, sitting in a neighborhood park for 30 minutes, and I see a clear, urgent problem, let's say I see people who are visibly hungry, or I see a dangerous intersection where kids are dodging traffic to get to school.
Right.
If I just sit quietly with my notebook, writing down, cars are moving fast, kids are running, isn't that deeply irresponsible? I mean, it makes me think about how much of our desire to help is actually just a desire to relieve our own internal discomfort at seeing suffering.
That's a really honest assessment.
We want to act immediately so we don't have to feel bad anymore.
Yeah.
But shouldn't the urgency of their suffering dictate immediate action?
That is the natural empathetic reflex. I mean, nobody wants to see people suffer. But the text introduces what it calls the curiosity check exercise to address exactly that tension.
What's the curiosity check?
The premise is that acting on unexamined urgency often actively hinders deep understanding. When we act immediately on what we think we see, we're acting on our neurological assumptions. And acting on assumptions leads to addressing complex needs with blunt methods that were never actually designed for them.
Okay, let's play this out with an example. I remember hearing a story about a well-meaning community group that wanted to help an underserved neighborhood. They noticed that high school kids were loitering around in the afternoons, looking bored, and sometimes getting into minor trouble.
I can already see where this is going.
Right. The group's immediate, urgent interpretation was, these kids are falling behind academically and they lack resources.
Is that an assumption?
A huge assumption. So they raised $10,000, bought a bunch of iPads, rented a room, and launched an after-school digital tutoring program.
Wow.
They opened the doors, and almost no one showed up.
A classic failure of the curiosity check right there. They reacted to the visual data kids loitering with an immediate, culturally biased interpretation. Lack of academic resources.
Exactly. And it turned out the kids didn't need tutors.
What did they need?
If the group had stayed in the observation phase, if they had talked to the kids without an agenda, they would have learned that the reason the kids were loitering on that specific corner was because there was a severe problem with aggressive stray dogs on the main walking route to their housing complex.
Oh my goodness. Stray dogs.
Yes. The kids were waiting on that corner for older siblings or adults to walk them the rest of the way home so they wouldn't get attacked. The community group spent $10,000 on iPads when they should have just called animal control.
That is unbelievable.
They rushed to fix a surface assumption and completely missed the actual pathology of the neighborhood.
Which perfectly illustrates the text warning. Humility requires staying curious longer to ensure the intervention actually fits the reality of the people, not just the assumptions of the leaders.
So true.
Another example the text hints at. Observing people who appear hungry and immediately launching a massive Saturday morning food pantry.
That sounds like a good thing, right?
It does. You spend thousands, you mobilize volunteers, and no one comes. Why? Because if you had observed the rhythms of the neighborhood, you would have realized those specific residents work third-shift warehouse jobs and are deep asleep on Saturday mornings.
Oh, well.
Or perhaps there's already a city-funded food program, but the real barrier is a lack of reliable public transit to get there. Urgency feels like faithfulness, but without context, it's just reckless interference.
Reckless interference, that's a great way to put it. Okay, so once we manage to restrain our ego, suppress our savior complex, and actually commit to observing our specific geography, what exactly are we looking for?
You need a framework.
Right, because the text doesn't just say look around and take notes. It provides a highly precise, layered diagnostic framework. It details 5 specific layers of a community map.
And these layers are brilliant because they force the observer to move systematically from the obvious physical realm into the invisible social realm.
What are the 5 layers?
They are physical spaces, relationships, influence, need, and rhythm.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think of mapping these 5 layers like a doctor reading an MRI.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right, because a regular photograph, which represents just the first layer, the physical spaces, the buildings, the roads, the parks, only shows the surface. You see the skin and the posture. Yeah. But adding the layers of relationships, influence, need, and rhythm is like adding the vascular system, the nervous system, the skeletal structure, and the respiratory rate overlays. You finally see how the body actually functions and breathes beneath the skin.
That's exactly it. Let's walk through these, starting with the physical layer.
Okay, go for it.
So the physical layer is the easiest to see, which is why most organizations stop there. We easily map the elementary school, the grocery store, the bus stop, the church building.
Basic geography.
Right. But even here, observation requires depth. You aren't just noting the presence of a park. You're observing how the physical space dictates human behavior.
Like what?
Like, are there benches? Or is there hostile architecture designed to keep the unhoused from sleeping there? Is the grocery store easily accessible by foot, or does it require a car, creating a food desert for the elderly? The physical infrastructure tells a story about who the city values and who it marginalizes.
That's so profound. And then we move to the relationship and influence layers. And the text makes a massive point about mapping people, not just physical coordinates.
This raises one of the most important questions in the entire framework. Where does trust actually flow in a community?
And it's usually not where we think it is.
Exactly. Trust rarely flows through official institutions or formal titled leaders. If a crisis hits, the neighborhood doesn't usually look to the mayor or the corporate CEO.
Right.
Trust flows through informal relational nodes. The text has an exercise called the relational web, where you're tasked with mapping how people actually connect.
You're looking for who the natural hidden connectors are.
Precisely. Maybe it's the grandmother who sits on her porch and casually watches 5 different kids on her block while their parents work.
Yeah, she knows everything happening on that street.
She really does. Maybe it's the barber who hears every piece of local news, conflict, and celebration. Maybe it's the night shift nurse who everyone goes to when they can't afford a doctor.
Wow.
If you ignore these informal nodes of influence because they don't fit your traditional top-down organizational model, you're entirely ignoring the actual nervous system of the neighborhood.
So how do you find them? Because to uncover those hidden layers of influence, the text introduces the listening to local voices exercises.
Yes, the listening drills.
There's a specific drill called the 3-voice listening drill. You are instructed to interview 3 different people: a long-term resident who holds historical memory, a parent or caregiver who understands the daily friction of the community, and a local worker or informal leader.
Right.
But the catch, and this is a massive catch, is that you have to do it without an agenda.
And that is agonizingly hard for leaders. The text asks a piercing diagnostic question here. Are you listening to learn, or are you listening to confirm what you already believe?
Oh man, that stings.
It does. In the listening without an agenda exercise, the goal is explicitly not to promote your organization, pitch a ministry idea, or subtly steer the conversation toward your solutions.
You can't just be waiting for your turn to talk.
Exactly. You are instructed to ask open questions and then listen without correcting, interpreting, or steering. You have to treat local residents as teachers rather than targets.
Treating them as teachers, not targets. That completely inverts the traditional power dynamic of outreach.
It completely flips it.
Usually the organization positions itself as the teacher, holding the knowledge, the resources, and the answers, while the community is just the passive target of their benevolence.
Right, the savior complex.
When you flip that, it requires a staggering amount of humility. And when you actually listen like that, you start to see things that your program-centric mindset blinded you to. Which brings us to the 5th layer, rhythm. This is the temporal map.
This one is so often overlooked. The influence and rhythm reflection exercise points out that rhythms dictate when a community breathes.
Yes.
If you don't map temporal rhythms, you design interventions for times when people simply aren't available.
How does a neighborhood experience time? The text has this household lens reflection, where it forces leaders to look outside the traditional nuclear family structure.
It asks you to study the temporal realities of single parents, extended multi-generational families living in one apartment, or migrant worker networks.
Right.
How do these specific households experience time poverty? How do they experience stress? If an organization implicitly assumes that every family consists of 2 parents working standard 9-to-5 jobs with weekends completely free, their entire structure of events, meetings, and programs will systematically alienate anyone who doesn't fit that mold.
This is so practical. I mean, if the only time you offer a community gathering is at 6:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the single mothers in your neighborhood are in the middle of commuting home, cooking dinner, and fighting through homework,
You're not helping them.
you haven't offered them an invitation. You've offered them an impossible burden.
It makes me think about the tragedy of hidden populations that the text brings up.
What's the question they ask about that?
Yeah.
There's a discussion question. Who disappears when your organization speaks in categories instead of names?
Wow.
When we only map broad demographics like low income or youth, we miss the invisible groups. We miss the exhausted caregiver. We miss the isolated elderly man. If you aren't doing this layered mapping, those populations remain completely outside your awareness, even if they live 50 feet from your front door.
And that leads to a profound realization that should humble any leader. The text asks, which relationships in your community already exist that your organization has never learned to honor?
We act like we're the first ones there.
We do. We often barge into neighborhoods with our savior complexes blazing, assuming we need to build networks of care entirely from scratch. We completely ignore the beautiful, deeply resilient networks of mutual aid and trust that are already functioning there. We don't need to invent the community. We need to respectfully introduce ourselves to it.
Okay, so we have restrained our urgency. We have mapped the 5 layers, the physical spaces, the relational webs, the informal influence nodes, the deep needs, and the temporal rhythms. We've identified the hidden population.
We've got the data.
But having a map doesn't mean you know how to navigate the terrain. You can know exactly where the hidden nodes of influence are, but if you walk up to them and sound like a corporate brochure, the door slams shut immediately.
Oh, instantly.
This is where we move into contextual intelligence and the ministry of presence. How do we translate this massive amount of observational data into actual, meaningful human interaction?
So Chapter 7 is devoted to discernment, turning data into missional insight. And it opens with a massive warning against reading a community purely through a deficit lens.
Explain the psychology of the deficit lens, because I think this is the trap almost every nonprofit and community group falls into.
It really is. So the deficit lens is rooted in the brain's negativity bias, but it's heavily reinforced by the way organizations raise funds and motivate volunteers.
Because they need a problem to solve to justify their existence.
Exactly. If your organization exists to serve or save, your brain is primed to look for the things that need saving. You scan the environment for problems. You look for poverty, for brokenness, for addiction, for failing schools, for what is missing.
Right.
And because the nonprofit funding model often requires sob stories to generate emotional responses from donors, leaders are financially incentivized to only see the worst aspects of a neighborhood.
It's the ultimate confirmation bias. If you go looking for a tragedy to fix, you will reduce every person you meet to a tragic figure. But the text insists we must counter this by actively mapping the assets.
Yes, the asset and opportunity scan in the practical applications demands that you identify what is already alive, strong, and thriving.
What are we looking for there?
What are the existing communal gifts? What are the local capacities? What specific knowledge does this neighborhood possess that you do not? If you only read a community through a deficit lens, you enter as a savior, and you inherently disrespect the people you claim to love.
That's powerful.
But if you recognize their assets, you enter as a partner, acknowledging that you have as much to learn from them as you have to offer.
That distinction fundamentally changes your physical posture when you show up. And Chapter 8 focuses heavily on presence as ministry. There is a question in the study guide that stopped me in my tracks.
What is that?
Is your organization known for showing up, or only for showing up with an agenda?
If we connect this back to where we started, this is the starkest difference between performative and embedded leadership.
Break that down again.
Performative leadership shows up to a neighborhood event to hand out a branded flyer, set up a booth, take a few high-quality photos for the year-end newsletter, and leave. It is entirely extractive.
And embedded leadership.
Embedded leadership shows up just to be present, to share in the joy or the grief of the community without asking for anything in return.
The text calls for a rigorous presence audit. You have to critically evaluate your organization on consistency, humility, accessibility, and relational depth. It specifically emphasizes the necessity of repeated, faithful contact in what it calls ordinary spaces.
And ordinary spaces are the transit points, the local markets, the waiting areas, the laundromats, the sidewalks.
The unglamorous places.
Right. These are the spaces where shared life actually happens, and where presence is infinitely more important than performance. The text challenges leaders to choose one ordinary public place and commit to being there regularly for at least 8 weeks without an agenda, without a clipboard, without pressure,
Just existing there.
just existing. You measure fruitfulness by the slow accumulation of relational trust, not by how many people you recruited to your next event.
But just physically being there isn't enough if you can't communicate in a way the community actually understands. You mentioned earlier that you can't just hand out a corporate brochure.
No, you definitely can't.
Chapter 9 deals with contextual intelligence and communication. And here is where it tackles one of the most stubborn barriers to connection: insider language and jargon.
Oh, jargon is the worst. Every profession, every subculture, and every organization develops insider language. It serves as a tribal signifier. Using the right acronyms or the right theological terms signals to the group that you belong.
It's cozy on the inside.
Right. But while it creates comfort inside the bubble, it creates an impenetrable moat for anyone on the outside. Churches and religious ministries are particularly notorious for using words, metaphors, and assumed narratives that are completely opaque to the general public.
The practical applications section has this incredible message translation drill. It forces leaders to take one standard invitation or organizational explanation and rewrite it for 3 completely different audiences in their mapped community.
That sounds challenging.
It is. You have to systematically remove all the insider metaphors, the religious jargon, and the assumed cultural knowledge. But I want to explore the resistance to this because I know this creates massive anxiety for leaders.
Oh, absolutely.
There is a question in Chapter 9. What would it cost your leadership to adapt communication without compromising truth? Why do leaders resist dropping their jargon? It's not just laziness, right? There's a real fear there. How does a deeply rooted institution translate its core identity without feeling like it's watering down its profound message just to be palatable to the masses?
That is the classic existential fear of the institution. If we change how we speak, are we secretly changing what we believe?
Exactly.
Dropping jargon makes leaders feel deeply vulnerable because they're stripping away the protective armor of their expertise. But the text provides a very clear, challenging answer to this anxiety. Adapting communication is not about diluting the truth. It is about clarity.
Clarity.
Yeah, if the audience you're speaking to does not understand the words you're using, you haven't been faithful to your message. You've just been familiar to yourself.
Faithfulness has been confused with familiarity. That is a brilliant way to frame it. We cling to the words we know because they make us feel safe, and we disguise that cowardice as ideological purity.
Exactly. The text asks, where have you confused faithfulness with familiarity? Using your specific subculture's jargon isn't a badge of theological or intellectual purity. It is a profound communication failure.
Wow.
The goal of the translation drill isn't to make the truth less profound, but to make the profound truth actually accessible to the listener's mind. When you rewrite that invitation, you aren't removing the core message. You are doing the hard work of removing the cultural baggage that prevents the core message from ever being heard.
So let's look at where we are. We have mapped the 5 complex layers of the community. We've audited our presence to ensure we're showing up without extractive agendas. We have translated our communication to pierce through the jargon and actually be understood.
We're ready to do something.
Yes, now we hit the friction point of implementation. Segment 5 is about designing, scaling, and pruning ministry. We have all this rich, nuanced data. Now we have to build or adjust the actual programs. But the text immediately warns us against building around habit.
This is the moment where the map has to disrupt the machine.
And the machine does not want to be disrupted.
No, it doesn't. Chapter 10 introduces a concept called need-to-method fit. Once you have identified a real, verified community need through your mapping and listening, you have to critically evaluate what kind of response is actually required.
And it might not be what you usually do.
Right. Does this specific need require quiet presence? Does it require immediate mercy and relief? Does it require long-term mentorship? Or does it require you to step back and simply partner with an existing local organization that's already doing the work?
And the text strongly warns against just pulling your organization's favorite legacy ministry method off the shelf and applying it to a new problem.
It's like a doctor prescribing a heavy, broad-spectrum round of antibiotics for a viral infection.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
The doctor feels very productive because they wrote a prescription. The patient feels cared for because they received a pill. But the intervention is completely blind to the actual pathology of the illness. It does nothing to solve the virus, and it might actually harm the patient's gut biome in the process. The text asks, what need are you addressing with a method that was never actually designed for it?
Give me a practical example of that kind of organizational malpractice.
Okay, Imagine your mapping reveals that there is a deep epidemic of social isolation among the elderly in a specific apartment complex.
Okay, isolation.
The actual need is for consistent, quiet, one-on-one relational presence. But your organization is culturally wired to run loud, highly produced, large-scale events. So to solve the isolation, you throw a massive quarterly banquet with a band and bright lights.
Oh, no.
It is the exact wrong method for the need. It overwhelms the elderly, it doesn't foster deep relationships, but your organization pats itself on the back because 200 people were in the room. You treated a virus with antibiotics.
To prevent that kind of massive misallocation of energy, the text advocates heavily for a strategy called pilot before scale.
Yes, start small.
Instead of taking your initial mapping data and immediately launching a fully funded permanent program with a dedicated staff member, you design a tiny, measurable response to test your assumptions.
It's the scientific method applied to community love. You take one specific insight from your map, define a small pilot, and ask, what would a wise, low-stakes first step look like?
A low-stakes first step.
You test it in reality, and you observe what the pilot reveals that a massive, ego-driven launch would have hidden. You see where the friction is. You see who actually shows up. Only then, after adapting to the real-world feedback, do you consider scaling it.
And keeping that alignment over time requires Chapter 11, measuring, revisiting, and adapting. The text demands the creation of a quarterly review dashboard.
But not the usual dashboard.
Right, it's not just tracking attendance or dollars raised, the metrics of broadcast logic. You are tracking 3 specific statistical metrics, 3 qualitative human stories, and 3 necessary adjustments. You are looking for concrete evidence that you're growing in faithfulness to the map, not just generating mindless activity.
But here is where the real institutional pain comes in.
The pruning.
Yes. The ministry relevance check. The text asks what I consider to be a devastating question for any long-standing organization. Which current ministry or program would collapse if it were judged only by its actual fit with the present community?
Wow. If we judged our programs not by how much our volunteers enjoy running them, not by how much historical legacy they have, but strictly by how well they actually serve the people currently living outside our walls, how many would survive the cut?
In many legacy organizations, very few.
Hmm.
The text demands that leaders cultivate the courage to retire, adjust, or completely replace programs that no longer serve the present reality of the neighborhood.
That's so hard to do, though.
It is. The neighborhood has likely undergone massive demographic and temporal shifts while your program has stayed exactly the same for 15 years. What would it mean for your organizational ego to let go of something good in order to make room for something necessary?
So what does this all mean for the exhausted leader listening right now? It means we have to stop romanticizing our own legacy programs.
We really do.
The text points out in Appendix 4 this vital concept of a mental bandwidth audit. It highlights the burnout and overreach check. I think we so often confuse faithfulness with sheer overload.
Just running on fumes.
We keep running exhausting programs that produce little actual fruit but consume massive amounts of human energy simply because we're terrified of the political fallout of stopping them. We're afraid of angering the donors or disappointing the volunteers who find their identity in that specific program.
We view stopping a program as an admission of failure, but the text frames it entirely differently. If a ministry drains the organization's bandwidth without actually advancing the mission of loving the community, stopping it is not a failure. It is an act of strict obedience.
An act of obedience, wow.
It frees up the cognitive and temporal bandwidth to be present where it actually matters. Furthermore, the text points out a reality that challenges everything we've been taught about scale. A smaller, hyperlocal response can severely outperform a larger, generic one.
I love that line. Where could a smaller, more local response outperform a larger, more generic one? That is the ultimate rebuke of the broadcast logic we started this whole conversation with. Bigger is not inherently better. Often, bigger is just less tailored, less intimate, and less effective.
Which brings us to the ultimate existential goal of this entire framework.
A legacy.
Right. Understanding the theory of mapping, peeling back the layers, and even summoning the courage to prune old programs. That is all necessary. But how do we ensure this isn't just another passing leadership fad? Organizations naturally default back to their deeply worn habits. How do we build a lasting culture of observation?
This is where we get into the actionable blueprint for a lasting legacy. The text knows that without structure, vision dissipates. So, Chapter 12 and the incredibly detailed appendices provide concrete, long-term frameworks to prevent this community map from just gathering dust on a shelf in the director's office.
It starts with the 90-day application plan. It breaks the overwhelming nature of this shift down into painfully simple phases.
Break it down for us.
So month 1 is purely observation. No action, just looking. Month 2 is listening and interpretation. Month 3 is launching one small pilot response and reviewing it. It forces a measured, deliberate pace that acts as a circuit breaker against our addiction to urgency.
And to lock that new pace into the DNA of the organization, the text suggests writing a mission covenant. This isn't just a vague vision statement. This is a one-page, binding commitment on how the leadership will permanently maintain rhythms of seeing, listening, and responding.
It holds you accountable.
Exactly. It's a document that asks what specific, scheduled practices will keep the mission field visible in our leadership meetings. You define permanent rhythms for observation so that mapping becomes a core part of your identity, not just a 6-week seasonal campaign you run once every 5 years.
And then the text moves into legacy planning. It asks you to cast your imagination 5 years into the future.
Okay, what are we imagining?
If this framework truly shapes your leadership, what daily habits will define you? What kind of deep, quiet trust will you have earned with the informal influence nodes in your city? What will the people in the neighborhood say your organization noticed that everyone else drove right past?
That is a beautiful vision.
The ultimate goal, as the text beautifully articulates, is an organization that sees what it once overlooked, loves where it once assumed, and serves with precise wisdom.
I want to highlight something incredibly practical from the advanced application section, though, the future readiness drill and scenario testing.
I think this part is brilliant.
The text asks leaders to imagine a sudden, severe disruption hitting their mapped community. Let's say a major local factory suddenly closes, laying off hundreds of workers. Or a natural disaster hits the region. Or a sudden demographic shift occurs due to new housing developments.
This is the ultimate stress test for everything we've discussed today. Think about how organizations react to a sudden disruption. An organization that operates on broadcast logic panics.
Right, they scramble.
They form a sudden emergency committee.
Yeah.
They put out a press release. They ask for donations. But they don't actually know who is most vulnerable or how to distribute help effectively because they don't know the relational web. They have to build a network in the middle of a crisis, which is nearly impossible.
But the embedded organization, what do they do?
The embedded organization doesn't panic. A well-mapped community allows for rapid, appropriate, hyperlocal contingency responses. Why? Because the trust pathways, the informal relational nodes, the grandmother on the porch, the barber, the night shift nurse you mapped in Chapter 6, they're already deeply known.
You already have their phone numbers.
Exactly. You don't have to build a network in a crisis. You just walk down the street and ask the trusted nodes who needs help first. You activate the network you've been faithfully walking alongside for years.
You're already in the bloodstream of the community. And to keep that map alive, the text offers a final, incredibly simple weekly practice. At the end of every single week before the leadership team goes home, they must ask 3 simple questions.
I love these questions.
What did we learn about our neighborhood this week? What did we change based on that learning? What will we do next? That constant, relentless feedback loop prevents the map from becoming a static historical document. It turns mapping into a disciplined, living way of leading.
It completely redefines the metrics of a successful community leader. Under the old model of broadcast logic, success meant being the loudest voice in the room, having the biggest platform, generating the most momentum, and being seen by the most people.
And under this framework,
Success is being the most attentive, patient listener on the street. It's the quiet trust, the faithful conversation, and the repeated, unassuming presence in ordinary places.
it's the profound shift from extraction to incarnation. Man, we have covered an immense amount of ground today on this deep dive.
We really have.
We started by diagnosing the exhausting trap of noisy visibility, how broadcast logic creates frantic activity without genuine relationship. We moved into the psychologically difficult discipline of silent observation, learning to read our physical geography with the same reverence we give our foundational texts.
Right.
We learned how to systematically peel back the 5 complex layers of a community, moving past the obvious physical spaces to uncover the hidden arteries of relationships, influence, localized needs, and temporal rhythms.
We explored the vital importance of translating our communication, shedding the protective armor of our insider jargon so we can connect clearly clearly without compromising our core truths.
Yeah.
We wrestled with the painful but absolutely necessary process of organizational pruning, finding the courage to retire inherited legacy programs that no longer fit the reality of the map, and choosing to pilot small, highly targeted responses instead.
And finally, we looked at how to build a lasting organizational legacy by covenanting to a permanent rhythm of observation, ensuring we remain deeply embedded in our neighborhoods, ready to respond to crises at the speed of established trust. So, for you listening right now, here's your challenge for the week.
Get your notebooks ready.
Take one of the exercises we discussed from Appendix 4. Find a public space in your neighborhood and do the 20-minute observation without interpretation block. Feel the friction of your brain wanting to categorize and resist it.
It's going to be hard, but do it.
Or sit down with your team and run a brutal assumption audit on your current projects. Stop guessing. Stop relying on the dopamine hits of broadcast logic. Start paying agonizingly close attention to the real complex people right outside your doors.
You know, we've spent this entire deep dive talking about how the discipline of mapping changes your understanding of the community. But I want to leave you with a thought that flips this entirely on its head.
Oh, let's hear it.
What if the ultimate secret purpose of this entire framework isn't actually to fix the neighborhood at all?
Wait, really?
Yeah. What if the intense discipline of observing, listening, and being quietly present is actually designed to dismantle the ego of the observer?
Wow.
By forcing you to physically stop, to withhold your assumptions, and to see the community as the teacher and yourself as the student, the map doesn't just change the mission field. It fundamentally converts the missionary.
It fundamentally converts the missionary. It dismantles the ego. What if the greatest barrier to your mission was never a lack of opportunity, but a failure of attention? It turns out that failure of attention was keeping us from seeing not just our neighbors, but ourselves. Open your eyes. Take up the map. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.